$6 for all three. The auctioneer's voice cracked through the hot, dust-choked air of the market square, and the laughter that followed was cruel and sharp. The year was 1872, and Redemption Creek was the kind of frontier town where every man's coin measured his worth, and every stranger's misstep fed the gossip of a dozen hungry mouths. People pressed in close, their eyes drawn not to cattle or horses, but to the three Apache women standing roped together on the rough-hewn platform. Their wrists were bound, their hair tangled from the ride. Yet their posture was defiant. Tall, strong, their beauty undeniable even beneath the dirt and humiliation. The rancher who raised his hand was Samuel Carver. 10 years had passed since his wife Mary had been buried under a crooked oak behind their ranch house. He had worn his loneliness like a second skin, ever since raising 2 children alone in a land that had no mercy for widowers or orphans. Samuel was 36 now, his broad shoulders marked by years of labor, his eyes sunken but steady. When he spoke, it was never to waste words, but when he called out, "I'll pay the 6." The silence that followed was heavier than gun smoke before a duel. Men turned their heads. A blacksmith spat on the ground. A saloon girl covered her mouth with a hand-stifling laughter. The sheriff, leaning against a hitching post, let out a low whistle. They all thought him a fool. Buying 3 Apache women enemies in the eyes of settlers was madness. And to do it for so little, as if they were cattle on clearance, only twisted the spectacle into a deeper insult. Samuel stepped forward anyway, pushing through the crowd, until he stood at the edge of the platform. The women's eyes locked on him. One pair blazed like coals, unflinching and furious. Another held sorrow so raw, it seemed she might collapse if not for the rope binding her to the others. The third, her gaze lingered on him a fraction longer, sharp and assessing. She was searching for something in his face, something she had not seen in the others who had jeered and bid on them. The auctioneer thrust out his ledger, eager to be rid of the transaction. Samuel dug out $6 silver, the sound of metal against wood echoing like judgment. He signed his name in slow, deliberate strokes. It was not just a purchase. It was a promise to himself, though he could not yet name it. "Crazy bastard," someone muttered. Another voice rang louder. "What you gonna do with 'em, Carver? Thinking you'll tame wildcats in your old shack?" The laughter returned, uglier now, teeth bared in mockery. Samuel ignored them. He had learned long ago that men with too much to say rarely had much worth listening to. The auctioneer cut the rope connecting the women to the post, then shoved them toward Samuel, as if washing his hands of the business. They stumbled, but they did not fall. Samuel caught the first woman by the elbow. She jerked away, chin lifted proud even in captivity. For a moment he almost admired her defiance more than he pitied her suffering. His children would not understand. They had asked him for help, for someone to ease the burden left behind when their mother died. He had searched for months, finding only cold refusals, or women who turned away at the thought of raising another's young in such a barren land. Then he had seen these 3 dragged into town like spoils of war, and something in him shifted. Not pity alone, not desperation alone, but a conviction that within them lived the strength his children needed, and perhaps the chance for something greater than survival. The women followed as he led them from the square. The crowd parted with sneers and whispers. Children pointed. A drunk man shouted a crude joke, but Samuel's hand drifted near the butt of his revolver, and silence fell quick as thunder. They walked together through the dust, an odd procession of 1 rancher and 3 bound women under the pitiless sun of Redemption Creek. At the edge of town, Samuel paused. He turned to the auctioneer, who had trailed behind with the papers. "Cut the ropes," Samuel said. The man looked at him as though he'd gone mad. "What, you'll never keep 'em docile if—" "Cut the ropes." Samuel's voice carried steel. The auctioneer hesitated, then shrugged and drew his knife. The bindings fell. The women rubbed their wrists, their freedom shocking the crowd as much as the purchase itself. Gasps rippled through the bystanders. A few men cursed under their breath, predicting Samuel's death by nightfall. But none of the women ran. They stood still, their eyes locked on him, caught between disbelief and suspicion. Samuel tipped his hat, his voice low but firm. "You walk free beside me now. My ranch is out yonder. You'll have food, a roof, My children need care. That's the truth of it. The woman with assessing eyes narrowed them further. Her lips parted, and in broken but clear English, she asked a single question. Why? It was the first word anyone had heard from their mouths all day. The crowd erupted with shock. Samuel felt every eye burn into him, but he did not falter. Because I know what it means to lose, he said. And I know what it means to fight for something worth keeping. The words hung heavy. He turned, mounted his horse, and gestured for them to follow. They did. Not because they trusted him, not yet, but because something in his voice rang truer than the mockery of the crowd. By the time they reached the ridge that overlooked his ranch, the sun was sinking red over the prairie. The house stood small but sturdy, its windows glowing faint with lamplight. 2 children ran out when they saw him crest the hill. They froze when they saw the 3 women behind him. Fear flickered in their young eyes, but so did a fragile hope. For the first time in a decade, Samuel Carver felt the weight of change pressing down on his shoulders. He had invited danger into his home, yes, but perhaps he had also invited salvation. The town thought him a fool. Perhaps he was. But fools sometimes carved new paths where wise men only built fences. And Samuel Carver had never been one to live behind a fence. The ride home was long and the silence heavier than the dust that clung to their clothes. Samuel led on horseback while the 3 women walked behind, unbound but wary. Every so often he glanced back. Their steps were steady, their eyes fixed ahead, their expressions guarded walls of stone. He wondered what they thought of him, whether they saw him as a rescuer, a captor, or simply another man who believed he had the right to claim their lives. Perhaps all 3. When the ranch finally came into view, the setting sun laid fire over the horizon, painting the rough hills in molten red. The small house stood at the center of tilled soil and ragged fencing worn from years of weather and neglect. 2 children, a boy of 12 and a girl of 10, waited on the porch. They had been watching the road for hours, as they often did when their father rode into town. But when they saw who walked behind him, their excitement turned to unease. The boy's eyes narrowed. He looked ready to reach for the shotgun leaned against the porch rail. The girl clutched the doorway, uncertain. Samuel raised his hand before either could speak. "They're with us," he said firmly. "They'll stay here now." The children exchanged a glance, and silence stretched. Finally, the girl asked in a small voice, "Are they dangerous?" "They're people," Samuel said. He dismounted and tied his horse. "Same as us. They'll eat at our table tonight." The words carried authority, but not ease. His son's gaze lingered on the women's, suspicion hardening into something Samuel recognized, fear sharpened by stories told around town of Apache raids and vengeance. Samuel remembered those same stories too. He knew what the community whispered, and he knew what it would mean to bring these women under his roof. Inside the house was modest, a single main room with a wide hearth, rough wooden table, and shelves lined with jars of dried beans, corn, and preserves. The children had cleaned earlier in the day, a ritual of waiting for their father's return. Now they watched uneasily as 3 strangers crossed the threshold. The women hesitated at the door. The tallest stepped first, her head high despite the dirt on her face. The second lingered close behind, eyes darting across the room like a bird testing for danger. The third, the one who had spoken in English, took the rear, her movements measured, observant. She did not touch anything, but her gaze took in every detail: the worn rug by the hearth, the photographs of Mary Carver on the mantel, the empty rocking chair where Samuel sometimes sat in silence. Samuel set bread on the table, ladled stew from the pot hanging over the fire, and motioned for everyone to sit. The children obeyed reluctantly, sliding onto the benches. The women stood for a long moment, tense, as if expecting a trap. Then the one who spoke English murmured to the others in her tongue, and slowly they sat opposite the children. The meal passed with few words. The clink of spoons against bowls filled the room. Samuel studied the faces around him. His daughter's eyes softened, first curiosity flickering through her fear. His son remained rigid, jaw clenched tight. The women ate cautiously, never lowering their guard. Halfway through the meal, Samuel's daughter reached for the bread and quietly slid it toward the second woman who had eaten the least. The woman's dark eyes widened slightly, then softened. She gave a small nod of thanks, no words spoken. For Samuel, it was the first fragile thread of something more than survival, a possibility that kindness could bridge what hatred had tried to burn. Later, when the children had gone to bed, Samuel sat near the fire. The three women remained at the table, speaking in hushed tones he could not follow. Finally, the one who spoke English addressed him. "Why here? Why us?" Her voice was careful, low, carrying the weight of mistrust. Samuel leaned back, staring into the flames. "My children lost their mother 10 years ago. They need more than I can give alone. When I saw you three, I knew you'd been taken against your will. I thought maybe together we could give each other a chance." The woman's eyes searched his face, skeptical. A chance for what? He hesitated, the firelight flickering over his weathered features. To live different than what this world expects. To be more than prisoners of loss and hate. The other women watched, their expressions unreadable. The one with sorrow in her eyes looked away as though the words cut too close. The tallest leaned forward, her voice sharp in her own tongue, and though Samuel could not understand the words, the tone was clear, warning distrust, perhaps even threat. The English speaker translated after a pause. "She says, trust is not given. It is earned. If you lie, she will know." Samuel nodded. Fair enough. The days that followed were marked by unease. The women stayed close together, moving through the ranch like shadows. They worked, but cautiously, as though testing the edges of their new world. Samuel's daughter began to hover near them, offering small gestures, helping with water, showing where the flour was kept. His son kept his distance, his distrust hardening into silence. At night, Samuel could hear the women whispering in their language by the fire, their voices carrying both sorrow and strength. The town, meanwhile, did not forget. Neighbors passed the ranch on horseback, slowing to stare. Rumors spread in the saloon that Samuel Carver had lost his mind, that he was harboring danger under his roof. One man claimed he'd seen the women scouting the land, preparing for an Apache raid. Another swore they were witches who'd cursed the ranch. Each story was louder than the last, feeding a fire Samuel knew would one day come to his door. But inside those walls, despite the fear, something was shifting. The youngest of the three women began humming while she worked soft melodies that carried through the house like threads of memory. Samuel's daughter hummed along one evening, matching the tune with hesitant notes, and the two shared a fleeting smile. The tallest woman, who had resisted the most, eventually took to chopping wood beside Samuel, her strength undeniable, her defiance tempered by practicality. And the English-speaking woman. Her eyes met Samuel's more often now, not with trust, but with something less rigid than before. Questions lingered between them, unspoken but waiting. In the stillness of those nights, Samuel felt the tension shifting from raw mistrust toward something more fragile. More dangerous, the possibility of belonging. But belonging came with a cost, and in redemption, Creek, nothing went unnoticed for long. The first week passed with guarded silences and the kind of uneasy peace that felt ready to splinter at the faintest touch. Samuel kept his distance, letting the women settle in as they willed, but his children were another matter. His daughter Emma followed them like a curious shadow, asking questions they could not understand. His son Jacob hovered on the edge of every room, watchful and suspicious, his hand never far from the old shotgun that leaned against the wall. It was on the 8th night, while the wind howled against the shutters and the fire snapped low, that the first real conversation took place. The three women sat close together, speaking in their own tongue. Samuel watched from the hearth, sharpening a knife more out of habit than need. When the English-speaking woman glanced at him, her eyes held a decision, as though a private debate had reached its conclusion. "My name," she said suddenly, her voice low, deliberate, "is Taya." The sound startled the others, both her companions and Samuel's children. Emma gasped softly. Jacob stiffened, and even Samuel froze mid-motion, the whetstone pausing against steel. Taya gestured toward the other two. "This is Sani," she said, pointing to the tallest, whose strength had been clear from the first day. "And this is Nalin." The one with sorrow in her eyes lowered her gaze at the sound of her name, as if it carried too much weight. Samuel nodded slowly. "Taya," he repeated, letting the name settle in the room. "Sani, Nalin. I'm Samuel. These are my children, Jacob and Emma. His voice was steady, but inside something shifted. Names meant recognition. Names meant humanity. It was the first stone laid across the chasm between them. Taya's next words came halting, her English rough but clear enough. We were not captured in battle. We were taken. She tapped her chest, then spread her hand wide as if showing a circle. We lived near the San Pedro River. Traders came. They brought whiskey. Men from town. They came too. We trusted wrong people. In the night they tied us. Her voice caught, and for the first time Samuel saw the iron in her eyes tremble. Emma whispered, "That's terrible." But Jacob muttered almost under his breath, "Or maybe that's what they want us to believe." His words cut sharp suspicion still thick as barbed wire. Samuel shot him a look, one that told him to hold his tongue. Yet Samuel himself felt the conflict stir. Every story had two sides, and the land they lived in was steeped in blood. Still looking at Taya, he knew she was not spinning lies for his benefit. Her truth sat heavy in the room, undeniable. Sani spoke, then her words a storm in Apache. Taya translated, her tone grim. She says men from your town laughed when we were dragged through the street. She says they spit at us. Called us animals. Samuel's jaw tightened. He had seen it himself at the auction, had felt the sneers burn into his back. He could not deny it. She's right, he admitted. That's what they did. But I'm not them. Nalin, silent until now, finally lifted her eyes. Her English was almost non-existent, but she whispered one word that carried more weight than a speech. Why? It was not the why of purchase anymore. It was the why of mercy, of shelter. Samuel leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. Because I know what it is to lose everything, and I won't stand by and let my children grow up believing cruelty is the way of the world. His voice faltered for the first time, softening. My wife was killed by men not so different from the ones who brought you here. My children watched their mother die. I've lived with that hole in my chest ever since. Maybe I can't fill it, but I can make sure no one else suffers under my roof. The fire hissed, the silence deepened. Taya translated softly for the others. Nalin turned her face away, but Sani's gaze lingered on him, fierce, yet not entirely hostile. Something shifted in her, though it was too soon to name. That night after the children slept, Taya remained by the fire with Samuel. The others lay curled in blankets, shadows of exhaustion etched deep in their faces. Sani does not trust you, Taya said quietly. Nalin is broken inside. She lost her husband and child before they took us. She thinks nothing good can come. And you, Samuel asked. Taya studied him, the flames reflecting in her dark eyes. I listen. I wait. I see your children. They are kind like their mother must have been. Maybe there is truth in your words. Samuel looked into the fire, remembering Mary's laugh, her touch the way she had sung to Emma as a baby. He swallowed hard. There is truth, but truth doesn't heal overnight. I know that. Days passed, and slowly the cracks in silence widened. Taya began teaching Emma a few Apache words, small things, water, bread, fire. Emma, in turn, taught her English phrases, giggling when the pronunciation tangled on Taya's tongue. Sani kept her distance, but Samuel noticed her strength put to work, chopping wood, hauling water, fixing the fence. She did it without being asked, as if labor gave her a shield against vulnerability. Nalin often lingered by the window, staring at the horizon as though searching for ghosts. One afternoon, while mending a saddle, Samuel overheard Jacob muttering to Emma, "They'll turn on us. Just wait." But Emma snapped back, surprising him with her defiance. "They're not bad. You just don't want to see it." The boy scowled, but Samuel caught the uncertainty in his eyes. Even Jacob's anger, Samuel knew, was rooted in fear, the fear of losing what little they had left. That evening, as they ate together, Taya spoke again. "The men who sold us," she said carefully, "they will not stop. They see money in women like us. If they learn where we are, they may come." The words chilled the room. Samuel met her gaze. "Then they'll find me standing in their way." For the first time, Taya's lips curved, not quite a smile, but something close. A fragile acknowledgement. The shadows of mistrust had not lifted, but within them seeds of trust had been sown. And yet Samuel knew that shadows always hid more than they revealed. Whatever truths had been spoken, there were still wounds left unspoken and pain that would surface when least expected. Secrets did not stay buried forever, not in a land where survival demanded they be faced. The knock came at dawn, loud enough to rattle the shutters. Samuel was already awake, lacing his boots by the hearth. He felt it before he heard it, the weight of trouble pressing against the door like a storm rolling in from the plains. Emma stirred in the loft above. Jacob reached for the shotgun by his bed, and the three women sat up from their blankets near the fire. Samuel raised a hand, signaling them all to stay quiet, then opened the door. Sheriff Amos Klein stood there with two deputies, dust still clinging to their coats from the ride-in. The sheriff was a thick man, his stomach rounded from years of saloon whiskey, but his eyes were sharp cold. He didn't waste time with greetings. "Carver," he drawled, "you've got property that doesn't belong to you." Samuel's jaw tightened. "You're mistaken." Amos leaned on the doorframe, peering past Samuel into the dim house. His gaze landed on the women still half hidden in shadow, their eyes wary. "There they are," he said with satisfaction. "Escaped hostiles. They were taken in under territorial authority. Belong to the marshal's office now, not you. You hand 'em over and we'll forget this foolishness." "They're not property," Samuel said, his voice low but steady. The sheriff chuckled as if Samuel's words were a child's protest. "Everything's property in this town if it can be bought and sold. You paid $6, didn't you? Call it what you want, but the law calls them fugitives, and I enforce the law." Behind Samuel, Taya stepped forward. Her English carried a sharp edge. "We are not fugitives. We were stolen." One of the deputies spat in the dirt. "Listen to that. Speaks English like a preacher's daughter. She's clever, sheriff. Dangerous, too." Samuel blocked the doorway with his body, his hand resting near the revolver on his hip. "You're not taking them." The sheriff's smile faded. His voice hardened. "You don't want to cross me, Carver. Folks already think you've lost your damn mind. Harboring savages, putting your kids in danger. You give them up now, and we'll call it square. Refuse." He let the words hang, the threat heavier than iron. Jacob, brash with youth, leaned forward from behind his father. "You can't just take people like cattle." "Boy," Amos said with a smirk. "You keep talking like that, and you'll end up 6 feet under, same as your ma." The insult hit like a strike across the face. Samuel's hand twitched near his revolver, but he held back. Violence here would bring more deputies, more trouble than he could fight alone. He needed time, not blood. "Give me until sundown." Samuel set his tone flat. "You want to drag people out of my home, you do it in daylight where the whole town can see." The sheriff studied him, weighing the challenge. At last he stepped back from the door. "Sundown, then. But mark me, Carver, when that sun sets, I'll ride back and I'll bring enough men to burn this place to the ground if I have to. Think hard about what side you want to be on." They mounted up and rode off, leaving dust in their wake. Samuel closed the door slowly, the wood groaning under his grip. The house was silent except for the crackle of the dying fire. Emma's voice was a whisper. "Papa, what'll we do?" Samuel looked at each of them, his children, the three women, their faces tense with fear. "We stand," he said simply. "If we run, we'll be hunted. If we give in, we lose more than them. We lose who we are." Taya met his eyes searching. "You would fight your own lawmen." "I'd fight anyone who tries to drag my family in chains," Samuel answered. The word family hung between them, startling in its weight. Sonny crossed her arms, her expression still skeptical but less defiant than before. Nalin lowered her gaze, grief clouding her features. And Taya. For the first time, her eyes softened, not with suspicion, but with something closer to respect. Through the day, preparations began. Samuel fixed the fence-set traps along the ridge, checked and cleaned his rifle. Jacob followed his father, his earlier bravado tempered by the reality of what was coming. Emma stayed with the women, showing them where supplies were kept, how to bar the shutters, how to move through the house if fighting broke out. In the quiet moments, Samuel found himself by the window staring out at the horizon. He thought of Mary, how she had believed in goodness even when the world showed her cruelty. He wondered what she would think of him now, standing against his own sheriff, risking his children's safety for 3 strangers. Yet he knew the answer already. Mary would have seen the women not as strangers, but as people worth defending. As the sun bled low across the sky, the ranch grew still. Dust rose on the horizon's riders coming. The sound of hooves carried on the wind heavy with menace. Samuel's grip tightened on his rifle. "They're here," Jacob said, voice cracking with a mix of fear and excitement. Samuel drew in a slow breath. "Remember, stay low. Protect each other. No one goes outside unless I say." The women stood behind him now, not in submission, but as allies bracing against a storm. Taya's voice was firm. "We will not go back. If they take us, we die fighting." Samuel nodded. "Then we stand together." Outside, torches flared as the sheriff and his men rode up, their silhouettes dark against the burning horizon. The first shouts rang out demanding surrender. Samuel stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, his figure framed by the glow of the fire behind him. The line between law and justice had blurred. And in Redemption Creek, the night was about to test which one Samuel truly stood for. The standoff at sundown never broke into gunfire. Samuel had stood his ground with the rifle steady in his hands, eyes locked with Sheriff Klein's across the torchlit yard. For a long, breathless moment, neither side moved. The deputies muttered, horses stamped, torches hissed in the dry wind. Then Amos spat, cursed, and pulled his reins. "You're a damn fool, Carver. This ain't over." They rode off into the night, their threats trailing in the dust. When the silence returned, it pressed down heavier than gunfire would have. Inside the house, Samuel leaned the rifle against the wall and let out the breath he'd held. His children clung to him, trembling. The women watched him closely, the firelight deepening the shadows across their faces. They had seen men stand tall before, but rarely had it been for them. The days after stretched taut with tension, yet life pressed forward. Fences still needed mending, cattle still needed feeding, and the children still needed teaching. Samuel worked harder than ever, and the women, once silent watchers, stepped in without asking. Sonny chopped wood at dawn, her arms swinging the axe with unyielding rhythm. Nalin tended the garden with Emma, her sorrowful quiet slowly softening under the child's gentle chatter. Taya stayed closest to Samuel, bridging words between them, all her sharp intelligence easing misunderstandings before they grew into cracks. It was in these daily labors that boundaries began to blur. Samuel caught himself watching Taya when she thought no one noticed, how she brushed back her hair with the back of her hand, how her eyes softened when she saw Emma smile. Once, when their hands brushed, passing a bucket of water, the spark was small but undeniable, jolting him in a way he hadn't felt since Mary. He pulled away quickly, ashamed of the thought. But it lingered, a quiet ember refusing to die. At night, when the work was done and the children asleep, conversations grew deeper. Taya spoke more of her life before capture, the river valley, the sound of drums during winter ceremonies, the way her mother's voice carried songs into the night. Her words painted pictures Samuel had never imagined, and he listened with the hunger of a man starved for more than silence. Sometimes Sonny joined in her stories, fiercer, laced with defiance against the world that had tried to chain her. Nalin spoke least, but when she did, her words cut through with a quiet sorrow that made Samuel ache. One evening, as the fire burned low, Taya asked softly, "Do you ever still dream of her, your wife?" The question struck deep. Samuel stared into the flames, feeling Mary's absence as sharp as it had been 10 years ago. "Every night," he admitted. "Some nights she's alive and I wake reaching for her. Some nights I dream of the day she died. Either way, I wake alone." His voice broke at the end, but he did not look away. Taya's gaze lingered on him, her expression unreadable. "Alone is the hardest prison," she said quietly. Their eyes held for a moment too long, and Samuel felt the air shift between them. He stood abruptly, muttering something about checking the barn. But outside, beneath the stars, he leaned against the post and pressed his hand to his chest, steadying a heart that had forgotten how to quicken. The children noticed too. Emma grew attached to the women quickly, especially Nalin, whose gentleness soothed the girl's loneliness. Jacob resisted, but over time, even he softened, though grudgingly. One afternoon, he caught Sonny repairing the broken hinge of the chicken coop. She glanced up at him with a half-smile, a rare crack in her armor, and Jacob blinked, almost embarrassed. The mistrust in his eyes faltered just for an instant. But beneath this fragile harmony, danger still loomed. The sheriff had not returned, but whispers carried from town men saying Carver had turned his ranch into a den of savages, some calling for vigilantes to ride out and take what the law had not. Each rumor felt like a shadow creeping closer, but within the walls of the house, another shadow grew brighter desire. One night Samuel found himself awake long after the others slept. He stepped outside restless and saw Taya standing in the yard, her face turned to the stars. She heard him approach, but did not move. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. "Your land is quiet. Too quiet. I listen for drums, for voices. The silence. It feels like a weight." Samuel nodded. "I used to think the same. After Mary passed, the silence nearly killed me." Taya turned to him, her eyes glimmering in the starlight. "But now," he swallowed hard, "now it feels less empty." For a moment, neither spoke. Then she reached out lightly, touching his hand, just a brush of fingertips. It was nothing and everything at once. Samuel's breath caught, and in that fragile second, he let himself feel what he had been fighting. The loneliness, the longing, the ache of 10 years of silence, it all bent toward her like a river finding its course. But he stepped back, breaking the contact, his voice rough. "This is dangerous. For you, for me, for all of us." Taya's eyes held his unflinching. "Love is always dangerous." The words haunted him long after she walked back inside. Days bled into weeks, and though no one spoke of it openly, something undeniable grew in that house. Emma laughed more freely, Jacob's shoulders carried less suspicion. The women moved through the rooms as though the walls remembered their footsteps. And Samuel, he caught himself smiling at small things again, something he had not done in a decade. But the world beyond Redemption Creek was not blind nor forgiving. And Samuel knew the moment would come when whispers turned to action, when the fire outside would test the fire inside. For now, though, in the fragile space between dread and desire, love had begun to take root where no one believed it could. And that root Samuel feared and hoped in equal measure was strong enough to crack stone. The storm broke just before dawn. For weeks, whispers had circled through Redemption Creek, men muttering in saloons, anger simmering over cards and whiskey. The sheriff's warning hadn't been enough for some. To them, Samuel Carver was a traitor, a fool who had shamed his own kind by sheltering savages. To them, the women were property stolen, a wrong that needed righting. On that gray morning, the rumble of hooves shook the ground before the sun had climbed the horizon. Samuel woke to the sound, already reaching for his rifle before he was fully out of bed. By the time he stepped onto the porch, Jacob beside him with wide eyes, a dozen riders fanned out across the yard, torches, blazing shotguns glinting in the dim light. "Carver," one of them shouted. "Step aside and hand him over. This ends tonight." Behind Samuel, the door opened. Sonny stepped out, first, axe in her hands, her dark eyes burning with fire. Nalin followed, silent but steady, her presence more unyielding than stone. And Taya stood tall beside Samuel, unarmed but unafraid, her gaze fixed on the riders like a hawk staring down a pack of dogs. Samuel's heart thundered, but his voice came steady. "These women are under my roof, my protection. You'll get them only over my dead body." The riders jeered, one firing a warning shot into the air. Horses reared, dust rose. Tension thickened until it was a living thing. Samuel raised his rifle, Jacob clutching his sleeve. For a terrible instant, it seemed the night would end in blood. But then a sound split the air, high and clear, sharp as a blade. A woman's voice. Taya stepped forward and spoke in English, her voice carrying steady across the yard. "We are not yours to take. We are not chattel. We are people. We choose where we belong." The declaration stunned the mob into silence. For some, it stoked their fury, but for others, it planted hesitation. A few men shifted in their saddles, muttering uneasily. Even hatred had limits when met with unflinching defiance. The standoff stretched until the first rays of dawn painted the sky, and in that fragile moment, the mob broke. One by one, the riders cursed, spat, and turned their horses, muttering threats they no longer had the stomach to act on. When the last hoofbeat faded into the distance, the ranch was left in silence, the kind that rang louder than gunfire. Inside, Samuel lowered his rifle with shaking hands. His children rushed to him, Emma clinging to Nolan, Jacob staring at Sonny with something like awe. Taya touched Samuel's arm, steadying him. For the first time, he didn't pull away. Life after that night changed. The town still whispered, but fewer dared to act. Samuel's neighbors, once suspicious, now kept their distance, some with respect, some with fear. The ranch, once hollow with loneliness, now breathed with voices, laughter, and the rhythm of daily work shared between them all. Months passed. Seasons turned. And what had begun as survival grew into something deeper. Emma called Nolan her second mother. Jacob followed Sonny's lessons in the barn with reluctant respect. And Samuel stopped fighting the pull that had bound him to Taya since that night under the stars. It was a quiet evening when he finally asked her. No grand gesture, no speech, just the two of them by the hearth, children asleep. Firelight flickering across their faces. He held out a simple band of silver, rough and unpolished, and said, "I don't know what the world will call us. I don't care. I only know this house feels whole with you in it. Will you stand with me as my wife?" Taya's eyes shone not with surprise, but with the calm certainty of someone who had already chosen long ago. She took the band, slid it onto her finger, and whispered, "Yes." The marriage was not held in town, but on the ranch itself. A handful of trusted friends stood witness. There was no preacher, only vows spoken before fire and sky. The children laughed. Sonny and Nolan stood at Taya's side, and Samuel, for the first time in years, felt the weight of loneliness lift. Together they built a life no one believed possible. Fields grew, cattle multiplied, and the house that once echoed with silence now rang with voices, different tongues, different histories woven into a single story. They had been strangers, bound by circumstance, thrust into fire by hatred and prejudice. But through trials and sacrifice, they had become something more. Not captor and captive, not savior and saved. A family. And in that truth forged in fire, they found not just survival, but happiness, hard-won, fragile, but real.